I think In the Mood for Love was very important to Wong Kar-wai in two ways. First, personally, because I think that this was a film in which he succeeded in working out something that brought him into filmmaking in the first place. It's the film that looks back to his second film, the first film that he really cared about, I guess, which is a film called Days of Being Wild. And he's spoken sometimes of this film as being the sort of unofficial missing part two of Days of Being Wild, the film that was never made at the time. Maggie Cheung once again plays a character called Su Li-jun, as she did in Days of Being Wild. He's never explained the Su Li-jun character, for example, who recurs in other films too, not always played by Maggie. And it does seem clear that this name, this person, this real or imaginary, has some personal meaning to him because he's returned to it compulsively again and again. He's never clarified what it is, but this is the film in which he comes closest, I think, to explaining what it means to him or why this character name is, eternally recurring in his work. Filmically and internationally, it was a crucial film for him because it broke through in ways that none of the previous films had done. It won him a huge new audience. I think he was pretty well known already by this time, partly because of Happy Together, which had won a Cannes Prize and been sold for distribution across the world. That in turn had built on the success of Chungking Express, which had been really quite a big hit in quite a few markets. But this was the one that really clinched it, because this film not only sold everywhere it could possibly be sold, it was a huge hit in every market. I think it was the highest grossing foreign language film in France, for example, in its year, which meant it was the most successful Chinese film ever made in terms of French distribution. The film refers to a past, a vanished past. And it's a vanished past that very few people knew. Even people in Hong Kong don't really recognize the world that the film evokes because it's a very specific world, which was partly, again, very personal to Wong Kar-wai, because the film is set predominantly in and around an apartment run by an elderly Shanghai lady. And she speaks Shanghainese, and she represents a little enclave of Shanghai people in the Hong Kong of the early 1960s. Wong Kar-wai grew up in exactly such an enclave. His father was a nightclub manager who had moved from Shanghai. It was a Shanghainese family. They spoke Shanghainese. They had minimal intersection with the local Cantonese community in Hong Kong in the early 60s. They socialized, they mixed, they mingled, they played games, they had dinners, etc., with the Shanghai community, based in Tsim Sha Tsui, now a sort of tourist central in Hong Kong, but then one of the more seedy and cosmopolitan areas of Hong Kong, home to quite a large number of nightclubs, one of which Mr. Wong Sr. managed. Those things have gone, by and large, and I think Wong Kar-wai is attracted to them because they've gone. I mean, he feels that something that he valued and loved and cherished and was an important part of his growing up is not there anymore. The film imagines this vanished world, and Wong Kar-wai has been quite frank that this is partly an idealized reconstruction of the period. The thing is that those were very seminal years in the development of Hong Kong, and whether you were born there or whether you immigrated there as a child, as Wong Kar-wai did, you were very conscious of the city changing radically around you in a way that most Westerners, for example, didn't experience. In Hong Kong, you were much more conscious because it's a much smaller place. It's more like a pressure cooker. You were very conscious that things you were used to were suddenly not happening anymore. Buildings you were familiar with were suddenly not there anymore, and they were being replaced by high-rise monsters, very modernist high-rise monsters. Nonetheless, the film speaks to this rather idealized, vanished past. I think that was universal. I think people, you didn't need to have experienced it to feel the potency of this vision. And it turned out that this vision spoke rather clearly to people in many cultures and of many ages, in fact, because its retro charm, its sense of emotions felt turned out to have a kind of universal pull. The emotional hesitancy, the emotional reserve, the difficulty in articulating feelings that made it very intense for viewers, and viewers related to it very strongly.
我今晚唔想返屋企。
I think to understand the genesis of In the Mood for Love, we have to look at it in the context of Wong Kar-wai's development in the period, particularly in the late 90s. The first thing to say is that he has a big disappointment, a big personal disappointment with Ashes of Time, because he sells the international rights to this film to a company, which then proceeds to re-edit the film. He takes legal action to stop them from distributing it, so the film is barely seen for quite a long time. Considering he spent 2 years shooting the damn thing, he's extremely unhappy that the film is not widely distributed around the world and is not winning the kind of acclaim that it might be expected to win. However, as we know, during the extended post-production of the film, he goes off and shoots a quickie called Chungking Express, which turns out to be a global hit. Suddenly, people are talking about him in a way that they were not before. And so Wong Kar-wai has one hit to his name. He goes on to make Happy Together, and Happy Together is also kind of a successful film. Now, Wong Kar-wai, in fact, as often subsequently, conceived of two films as a kind of diptych in the wake of the success of Chungking Express. And he thought of it in terms of the 1997 date, which was approaching. 1997, just to remind you, was the year when Hong Kong reverted from British colonial administration to the motherland, to China. China resumed sovereignty over Hong Kong. So this was obviously a large date in the minds of everybody in Hong Kong. And Wong Kar-wai, thinking about this, decided to make one film in China and one film as far away from China as it was possible to be. So his concept initially was that the China film would be called Summer in Beijing and would be largely concerned with a relationship in terms of food. He's kind of a foodie, and it was very natural for him, I think, to think of food or relationships in terms of what the people were eating. I mean, pretty much all of his films have some kind of food in them, although it's usually junk food, as in Chungking Express. The other film was going to be, it wasn't quite clear what it was going to be at the very outset, but it turned into a film set at Hong Kong's antipodes, which is Buenos Aires. A film about Chinese people traveling as far away from Hong Kong as they could possibly get, literally the opposite side of the globe, where they would act out a relationship or the breakdown of a relationship which would have certain implications in terms of not only their lives, but might have some metaphorical resonance vis-a-vis the feelings of Hong Kong people. So there was going to be a diptych, one half talking about getting away from Hong Kong, the other half sort of embracing the return to the motherland. I mean, looking at two sides of a coin. Well, as we know, Summer in Beijing didn't get made at that time, partly because Happy Together took such an awfully long time to shoot. So the endlessly protracted shoot and subsequently edit of Happy Together basically vetoed any shooting on Summer in Beijing, which never got further than a poster, I don't think. And Summer in Beijing, I think the death knell was sounded to this project when he discovered he had a fundamental disagreement with the authorities in China. The Film Bureau in China, the government's film office, made it clear that he would not be allowed to shoot a film with no pre-approved script. And however much he explained that he was going to, he didn't work with scripts in that sense. He wrote the script as he went along and allowed space for the project to organically develop as it proceeded. They said, no, but that, doesn't correspond with our method, our system, our structure. And so, you can't do that. So at that point, Wong Kar-wai decided that there was no way that he was able to make a film in China. So the idea of Summer in Beijing being shot in Beijing was ended, axed. So he brought it back to Hong Kong and started thinking about how to do it in Hong Kong. As is the way with him, he lets ideas simmer, he lets them develop, he lets them gradually morph as he thinks about them more, and they change into something else. I'm not even sure if it had a title at that point, but it morphed into a relationship movie with Tony and Maggie playing not lovers, people moving in towards a relationship because their spouses were having a relationship, an affair, but which was conceived as a kind of jokey, amusing thing. In the Mood for Love itself morphed into a much, much more serious piece. It went through quite lengthy development, and it was very tentative at the start. It was like a model of Wong Kar-wai's production method, the most profligate, inefficient kind of production you can possibly imagine. You'd think it would be a nightmare for an independent producer, and it was a nightmare for the independent producer because Wong Kar-wai was his own producer, and he almost went bust making this film because it took 15 months finally. It took 15 months partly because it took such a long time to evolve the tone, the style, the look, the feeling, and the themes of the film, but also because he shot the film twice. He shot it first in Hong Kong. It already morphed during the Hong Kong shoot from the jokey business of the food and the dancing and such into the more serious film about feelings, emotions, repressed emotions, and guilty emotions. But he shot it. He shot a complete version of the film in Hong Kong with Chris Doyle on camera. He then took off. As I said, the project always was to make a diptych, and they were going to be linked films in some way. He decamped to Bangkok to start shooting 2046. Took one look at Bangkok's Chinatown and said, this looks more like Hong Kong in the 1960s than anything in Hong Kong. You know, we should have shot on location here, and proceeded to do so. So he shot the film again. It was soon after that decision that Chris Doyle walked out, somehow unwilling to shoot the film again, and Mark Lee came in to take over. But I don't think it mattered very much who shot the film. I would defy anybody seeing the film to say who shot what, because it actually looks very much of a piece all the way through, and that's because the actual DOP was Wong Kar-wai. For the first time in his career, this was a film where he knew exactly what he wanted. He knew exactly the framing, exactly the lighting, exactly the look of the film. Hong Kong has changed out of recognition since the 1960s. There's very little trace of old Hong Kong. So this was a problem Wong Kar-wai had already confronted in Days of Being Wild, 10 or more years earlier, because that was a film also set in the 1960s in Hong Kong, and there's almost nothing there in Hong Kong that will represent that period anymore. So one of the reasons the film is shot in the way it is, with those fixed angles, with much, much less freedom until they get to the Philippines anyway, is because they were constrained in their choice of locations. There were so many things. If you panned the camera, you would have caught something modern. It would have been something anachronistic and something that didn't fit. So that obsessive return to the same angle, the same locations, which happen again and again, and is carried all the way through to In the Mood for Love, is to a large degree determined by the need to find credible period locations. There have to be angles which exclude the modern world and will stand for Hong Kong in the 1960s, and there weren't too many of them. I think we've pinpointed certain things that are in Wong Kar-wai's mind, which led him towards this particular aesthetic. But in the meantime, you have to also remember that over the preceding 10 years, since he made Days of Being Wild, things have changed for him, and his sense of what is possible for him has also changed. In the 1990s, he was spending his time looking at art films. Suddenly, this is a director who has a very different sense of what is possible in cinema and what his status might be in cinema and what context he might be working in. So suddenly we have a director who, unlike the Wong Kar-wai of the 1980s, is familiar with Robert Bresson, is familiar with Luchino Visconti. So he has said himself in some interviews that one of the things he learned from Bresson was that how expressive a close-up can be. And Bresson is the one who teaches him how you can do certain things with a concentration on detail. That you don't have to show a lot of off-screen space. A lot can be connoted by just showing one very loaded detail. And that's what he starts to do. So a lot of the detail work, I mean, this is Siu Ping Lam's work as a props man on the film. He's coming up with objects that will connote more. You can focus on a telephone which rings and then stops ringing, and just the camera can hold the shot. He found out that, that cinema was more than he had previously thought. And he has much more sophisticated ideas about what you can do with images, what the textures and colors and designs of images can give you in the shooting. And that's also a reason for doing away with the kind of rather free-form handheld camera work that Doyle had excelled in, because you don't get that. If the camera is wheeling around the room and the space, you don't get the full value of design. The design becomes secondary or incidental almost, or, hastily glimpsed, briefly glimpsed. Here he wanted monumental compositions where everything was determined and everything was carefully planned. It's not totally an accident that the props man on the film became one of the lead actors in the film, because he was a key figure. I mean, he was somebody who was finding those 1960s telephones and finding those 1960s clocks and all the other little signs of the period that fill these frames.
都唔係真嘅。
He's working in a much more sophisticated way with William Chiang by this time. William Chiang is very slightly younger than Wong Kar-wai, but they are both boys from Shanghai families brought up in Hong Kong. They met at some point in the 1980s and they began working together in the 1990s. What Wong Kar-wai found in William Chiang was first another person very close to his own background, but crucially different in the sense that William is gay and Wong Kar-wai is not gay. And it was one of those relationships like Bertolucci and Scarfiotti on The Conformist, where a straight man and a gay man found a kind of kinship, and the straight man fed off the gay man's inspirations, ideas, and very different perception of certain things. So I think that the relationship between Wong Kar-wai and William was very much that. The relationship is kind of symbiotic and produced a kind of closeness which Wong Kar-wai does not have with any of his other collaborators. So William was hired initially as the art director stroke production designer of the films, and he turned out to have a very substantial input in that. But at some point in the mid-1990s, I guess it was on Ashes of Time, which is a film that went through something like half a dozen radically different cuts. And I think William was one of the people who took over the cutting at one point during all of that and became the editor. After that, he became a supervisory editor for all the films and remains so, I think, to this day. So it is a very close relationship. Wong Kar-wai is in person very shy, doesn't like appearing in public very much. I mean, will do it when he needs to do it, but particularly in Hong Kong, doesn't do it really, or very, very rarely does it. And I think for him, there is definitely a sense of projection into his stars in that they represent figures that he would like to be or wishes he could be. They have the kind of assurance, the confidence, the glamour, the looks. Wong Kar-wai is rather tall, and he's always felt slightly awkward, slightly misfitty. I mean, slightly not quite fitting in. I mean, slightly self-conscious about his size and his looks. So Wong Kar-wai, I think, projected many of his desires and wishes into characters, and for him it was very natural to go for the most glamorous people that he could find. He became rather overconfident about it because of his enormous success, in particular with Fei Wong in Chungking Express. But Fei Wong had never acted before. She was from Beijing. She had arrived in Hong Kong. She was pursuing a career as a singer, essentially. But because she became kind of, an international favorite on the strength of her appearance in Chungking Express, he became a little overconfident, felt that he could do this with anybody. And the next film, proved his ruination. Fallen Angels. One story in Fallen Angels stars Leon Lai and Michelle Rayns, both of whom conspicuously failed to ignite the screen. And Wong Kar-wai ruefully admitted that he'd made a mistake. This, I think, helps to explain why he's drawn back to favourite actors, particularly Tony Leung. Tony Leung has become, I think, increasingly central to Wong Kar-wai's vision. After Chungking Express, it became very clear that Tony Leung, he'd been just one of the crowd, I think, in Ashes of Time, but from that point on, he became, a key figure, and it was not an accident that after Fallen Angels, a film in which he doesn't appear, he became, Wong Kar-wai fell upon him and has never let him go since. Well, Wong Kar-wai is, yes, he's totally in love with the charisma of his actors, feels that it's an essential ingredient in the film. He doesn't feel that he's the kind of director who tells the actor what they have to do. He's not a very hands-on director in terms of how to give the performance. And in fact, both Tony Leung and Maggie Cheung have spoken rather ruefully about how little direction they had and how little they knew what was going on or what the character was supposed to be. But I think for the actors, this is a quite frustrating process. It's not the easiest thing in the world to act in these circumstances, especially if it's going to drag on and on and on, and you're going to have to turn down other work in order to stick with it. Which was Maggie Cheung's position. I think it was not Tony Leung's position, but it was Maggie's position that she was used to doing several films a year and you know, getting a certain amount of income from these things. And here's Wong Kar-wai basically demanding her exclusive services for 15 months. One reason that they fell out, rather, and that her involvement in subsequent films, particularly in 2046, was it was rather difficult for various reasons. But she decided she wasn't willing to go through this again. Doyle always used to speak of working with Wong Kar-wai as a process, a continual business of being in the process of discovering something and trying something out. There was, quite a bit of fine-tuning took place after the first screenings of the film, partly because the enormous rush to finish the damn things for their premieres at Cannes. But then he feels free to recut, to rethink, to revise. So the version that's on this disc as we speak is not exactly the same as what played in Cannes in May 2000. It's something fine-tuned since then. So even there has been some further process. I think In the Mood for Love is both some kind of peak, it's certainly a peak for him personally, and also a millstone, because I think Wong Kar-wai's work has always been fundamentally very personal for him. In the Mood for Love is the film in which he comes closest to, emotional openness. For him, that's a triumph. And he helps quite a large audience around the world to connect with the film. But also it's a millstone. It becomes very hard once you've done that to go back to the kind of innocence that you had before when you were denying it or deflecting it or being oblique about it. It becomes very hard to go back to that. And I think much of the difficulties that Wong Kar-wai had in shooting 2046 are to do with the fact that he had opened up so much in The Mood for Love. One could almost think that this was also true in My Blueberry Night. He had some difficulties there too, I think. And in my view, all of these problems, the problems that he has had in his latter day work, spring from the fact that he